Today's webinar is being co-hosted by a number of LCCs, including the Great Basin, California, Desert, Great Northern, Southern Rockies, and the Plains and Prairie Potholes landscape conservation cooperatives. For those of you who may be new to the LCCs, we are partnerships among public and private groups that are working together to meet large-scale conservation challenges. Since there are very many people on this webinar, we ask that you type in your questions as they arise. We'll be reading out these questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on our website. On your screen, you'll notice a small collapsed panel in the upper right-hand corner. If you click on the small arrow button, you can expand the control panel. In this control panel, you can type in your question. Simply type into the chat area and press send. The question will be sent to us to respond to at the end of the webinar. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Paul Rogers, Director of the Western Aspen Alliance. Paul holds a bachelor's and master's in geography from Utah State University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, respectively. He also holds a doctorate in ecology from Utah State University. Paul's prime areas of study are aspen ecology, biogeography, large-scale monitoring, and lichenology. As Director of the Western Aspen Alliance, Paul coordinates interdisciplinary efforts to increase the awareness of aspen issues and current science among natural resource agency managers, as well as government and university researchers. Paul, I'd like to send control of the webinar to you and ask that you take it away.
Thanks, Rick, so much, and thanks, Great Basin LCC, for hosting this as well as the other LCCs, and I sure appreciate the participants for being on today. I'll try to scurry through the presentation and still be clear, but I hope to answer your questions at the end of this time. Just as a starter, my background is in geography and then with some ecology as well, so I've worked all over the western states. I think I've worked in every one of the western states as well as overseas on ecological issues related to human impacts on vegetation at large scales. So for today's discussion, I've changed the title slightly, but basically I'm going to be talking about quaking aspen management and infusing some climate and fire information and trying to bring it back to a practical realm that I hope is useful to land and wildlife managers around the region. On your screen you should see an outline now of where I'm headed with this talk, just a little bit of background on why we should care. I think most people are aware of the benefits and attributes of aspen ecosystems. Normally I take several slides to cover this. I've shortened it a little here, and I'm going to move right into the subject matter, talking about changing paradigms in aspen ecology that just in the last decade or so, things are switching quickly, so you might say this is not exactly your grandfather's aspen ecology talk. I'm going to talk about functional and fire types, and that's really the meat of the matter here in terms of what I'm concerned about, and then applying that to what I'm calling Climate-Aspen Offsets, meaning that these two factors offset each other, and there's a little bit of give and take, and I'll explain that in more detail. And then finally, I'm going to get it down to the more practical side of thing, and what do we mean by resilience management in the context of aspen ecosystems. So just as a teaser, as a starter here to get us all in the right mood, looking at a couple of landscapes here. First of all, this fire here on Monroe Mountain in, I believe it was 2013 or thereabouts. You notice the patchy nature of this, and this happens with a lot of fires, but aspen, traditionally known as an asbestos forest, doesn't often burn very well unless there's a high mix of conifers, a wide range of conifer species in there. And even within the burn, you can see there's different intensities, and for those with a real discerning eye can see some regrowth already taking place just 1 year after this fire. So that mosaic, that fire or the aspen asbestos perspective is shown here, and then the next slide is a different kind of what I'm calling a microscape, but also examining fire. And you see some of the same elements. You see some detritus of aspen parts in there. If you look closely, there's an aspen stem that's burnt off. This is the Peterson Hollow fire that was just extinguished about 30 days or so ago here in northern Utah, right along the Utah-Idaho border. But you see burned and unburned. Obviously, those who from the forest ecology background see the serotinous cones of lodgepole pine, which are opened after the fire. They're doing just what they are supposed to, but some are not opened. Some areas burned, some not, and there's some fertile ground for aspen seedlings, which I'll talk about later, as well as probably a proliferation of aspen suckers that is arising asexually from roots. So we have quite a bit of diversity, and that's probably going to be an undercurrent or a theme of this entire talk, is that we don't want to just go with a one-size-fits-all aspen ecology or management. So a little bit, just very quickly, why we should care. Probably the number one reason in North America, but certainly with European aspen, is biodiversity, and the biodiversity that's harbored in aspen ecosystems. But there's a lot of other things: recreation, water retention, fire protection, aesthetics, forage, wood products. Something I often manage that's overlooked is just ski resorts in the real estate industry alone attached to ski resorts. There's a lot of high dollar value on aspen intact or sustainable aspen ecosystems. But let me drill down just a bit here to kind of get you thinking creatively about biodiversity. We often think of Utah and Colorado as being sort of the high aspen coverage states, but it's those states with a low coverage that aspen could have the highest value. And what I'm saying there is an inverse relationship. In states like California, Arizona, Nevada, where aspen covers perhaps less than 1% of the forested landscape, those ecosystems are probably the highest value for biodiversity, because aspen does harbor among forested ecosystems the highest or near highest, maybe second to riparian, in biodiverse systems, both plants and animals. And so the less we have on the landscape, the more vulnerable those systems are, but the more biodiversity at the landscape level that they will be encouraging. So just something to think about there. Sometimes we get in this numbers game where we think aspen's only important in those high coverage states, but in some ways it's more important in places where it's of low coverage at the landscape and state and regional scales. So what about this idea of professional pride or on our watch? I've had a couple of district rangers actually use this phrase: I just don't want the system to collapse on my watch. This is the Schultz fire 2010 in the Flagstaff area in northern Arizona. And if you look very closely, you can see there's a lot of stems that have come up. This is 1 or 2 years later, I believe 1 year later. You can also see that there's a lot of mass movement in the left side of the screen down the gully where a lot of wood debris has come down. And so what I'm suggesting here is that those stems that are short, about 1/2 to 1 meter in height, have been browsed, nearly every one, and that supports a lot of understory growth and vegetation. Without that, there's a lot of soil loss and actually mass movement when we had this flooding event 1 year later. So of course these systems are attached, and we're not just preserving aspen, the tree. That's not our goal here, but these very intricate aspen ecosystems that have connections to many other important resources. So on to this theme of changing paradigms, because I want to drill down on some of these things a little bit here. The conventional wisdom was really focused on serial aspen communities and a successional pathway where aspen dominates after some disturbance, and over time, perhaps 80 or 100 or 200 years, you would have a conifer-dominated system without any disturbance. Well, that's become a changing paradigm, you might say. So it's not all necessarily about the suckers. We're discovering, the more we look, that there's sexual reproduction. Just a few years ago, that was called rare and unimportant in the ecology of aspen. Now we find ourselves learning about the importance of that, and we still have a lot to learn. A mass of large old clones dominated ecosystems, and we find more clones the more we look at things from a genetic perspective. And so on, single successional pathways, as I described, and a single ecological type that's disturbance dependent. Contrast that with this evolving paradigm that sexual reproduction is more common. There's a higher genetic diversity on landscapes that we've studied, in more detail, but there's multiple aspen types. So even though aspen is widespread across the continent, we don't want to look at it all as one system and all to be managed in the same way. And then this idea of interacting disturbances and how does that play out on the landscape. By the way, in many of these slides, I'll be putting down some references along the basin. I'm happy to refer back to those or get you that information. And some of the key ones that I use repeatedly in this presentation are listed at the end. And this idea just of sexual reproduction in the panel in the upper right, you can see a sucker and then a seedling from the same fire. Here, this happens to be from the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico. That was 2011. But there's a whole string of these documented now. So once something that was rare is no longer rare, and mostly these seeding events are occurring in mixed to high severity fires. The one exception there is a very important exception. 2007 was an active management treatment in Alberta in which aspen seedlings were found approximately 200 meters higher in elevation than they had previously existed. So that's an important consideration as we move on and we talk about climate effects on aspen ecosystems at a regional scale. So an example from the Bridger-Teton Forest and this is something that most land managers will be familiar with. So we have this massive acreage here, one of the largest national forests in the lower 48. The aspen coverage is about 4.8%, call it 5%. The total aspen area burned, 14.3% of that. If you do a fire rotation period calculation, 587 years if we were to burn through all the aspen. Now that's a simplified calculation, but nonetheless, most people, even vaguely familiar with fire ecology, would say that's way above the norm. So there's some fire suppression there, but I would submit to you that we've come out of the wettest century, the 20th century, in most of the region of the past 1,000 years or so. So it's climate and fire suppression are factors there. And you can see that in this histogram of age classes, and this is pretty typical wherever I've done aging throughout the Intermountain West and Western states. It's basically the predominance of trees is in that, say, 80 to 110-year-old age class. Not coincidentally, a period prior to federal regulation and large-scale burning, both after active treatment such as logging but also after grazing. Burning was the tool du jour in the late part of the 19th century. Add that to natural burning and perhaps some remnants of Native American burning, and there was a lot of burning going on, and then follow that by a wet century. And so this pattern is pretty typical, but I don't want people to take away too many generalizations, but I have seen this over and over again. So, but on to the message here that not all aspen are fire dependent. These persistent or so-called stable aspen stands see very little fire, and so they're not dependent on a stand replacing disturbance for their life cycle, you might say. Their functional ecology, I'll use that term. And so how do they reproduce? Well, it tends to be in small gaps, individual trees, small root rot pockets and other pathogens, sometimes drought taking out some things, but not really fire-dependent systems. So that brings us to this idea of functional aspen types. And at the broadest scale, the continental scale, we've kind of outlined these types in a paper that we did a few years ago, and I have reference to that at the end. But basically, they're split into these serial and stable types, as well as a serial stable or going either way riparian type, and then within that subtypes of serial boreal and montane, as well as a host of stable types. That is, that pure is synonymous with stable. Another look at that with some photos to get your eye on that. So the Canadian parklands are stable type, elevation aspect limited. We've all seen these on the landscape, but also some of these things that may be terrain isolated, perhaps surrounded by non-forest types. And how do we treat those is what this is going to come down to. Are those treated in the same way as, for example, a montane serial type, which is very disturbance dependent? And so the point here is that these systems react differently to climate and disturbance, and perhaps that should drive our management approaches to them. And then that's just dividing them up again in those broader categories. So again, some more photos of how this looks on the landscape. And we've looked at the continental scale, but some of those were more landscape scale designations. So this montane cereal aspen, probably the dominant type in our region, but also you have on different aspects at this landscape scale, these stable communities that occur on south-facing slopes often or at lower elevations. Similarly, you can see the snow pocket type aspen in the upper right there. There's actually a small home in that. This is in northern Utah. And then a riparian type in this instance, this is a stable riparian community, meaning that there's no competition from conifers and it would not be expected to be influenced by fire and fire ecology. I just want to alert people to this book that's coming out very quickly. This is a handbook that's very much made for on-the-ground practitioners and managers, and this is produced by the BLM and will be going hopefully out on the streets within the next few months. So this will outline a lot of the things in my talk and then more, but you'll see it has with emphasis on BLM lands, meaning the lower, drier things as a generality, but there's a broad discussion of aspen ecology in these different types with a lot more detail in that. So another example of this, this dichotomy that you see on a landscape between stable and cereal environments. If you look in the high upper left there, we have what we call a see-through stand. That's terminology coined by Dale Bardos and Bob Campbell many years ago. The point being that there is really a single structure of just mature trees there, a single age structure, and there's really some missing age classes there, and we'll get into that pretty soon. But even in just by the different coloration of the leaves on the right side of the screen in that stable environment, you can probably sort of putatively pick out some different aspen clones based on that. But you can imagine that these would have different disturbance impacts and influences. So similar to the functional types and in parallel with them, you might say, Doug Shinneman and our co-authors a few years ago wrote this review paper talking about different aspen fire types. Those should be coming up on your screen on the left, and basically it's a continuum from fire independent, meaning the stable type in the lower left of the graph that rarely, if ever, sees fire, versus fire influenced, often adjacent to more flammable communities, and then more fire dependent depending on cohort conifer species, and then from 3, 4, and 5 you generally go up in elevation, have less frequency of fire, as you can see on that graphic on the right. And so basically we're trying to get folks to think about different aspen communities. Many of you are already familiar with these in your area, but putting a name and a label on it and somewhere where we can go for aspen prescriptions that are related to those types is a useful step, we believe. Just to show a little humility, there's always exceptions. So this is from that Monroe Mountain fire, which incidentally was a prescribed fire that got a little out of control, but hopefully, luckily not too much damage. But you can see this fire burned into a pure or stable aspen stand, approximately 100 meters or so up the hill, and then it settled down a bit. But it burned very hot into that. And unlike conifer stands, you can have a stand replacing fire in pure aspen in which the flames do not get above a half a meter or so. So they burn around the base. They can kill all those trees, if not the first year and subsequent years. They don't have to be crown level fires to completely kill whole stands. So in this case, we have that buffer area where the fire was hot enough and burning uphill that it really burned very strongly into the stand but eventually laid down. So this would be that fire influence type. Just another kind of a rare example here from central Utah, and I'm forgetting the name of this particular fire, but a fire-scarred aspen is very difficult to find. So this is an aspen tree that was burned on the right side and lived, and that we could fire scar down the line a little bit further. But again, another pure aspen stand in which fire crept into that but did not burn very far along the way. Okay, so breaching the Climate-Aspen Offsets topic, I think many of you have seen different graphics like this. I just pulled this up from the NOAA National Climate Data Center site a couple of days ago. And this is about 115 years or so of climate record. And you see that there's that dramatic warming that's going on. I think we're all aware of that, and it becomes more pronounced the longer the time scale you look at. my point here is to kind of give some context to the idea that regional climates vary. This graph might not look exactly the same. It will look very similar for temperature for most of the western states, if not most of the United States. But if we throw in precipitation, as I have with these just a couple of monthly snapshots of temperature and precipitation, we see a lot of variability. So though we have pretty high confidence in temperature and temperature patterns over the last many millennia as well as more recent times, precipitation is widely variable. It's expected generally to be decreasing in the next 100 years in the south and southwest, variable in the middle, and perhaps even increasing in parts of the west. So we shouldn't lump those things together, and we need to consider those in terms of our context, that regional variability in climate. Secondly, as I alluded to already, be aware of your aspen type and what the functional ecology of that system is so that you might manage in tandem with disturbance and disturbance ecology as opposed to fighting against it. And the reason why I say this because it wasn't long ago that every aspen stand was treated with what's commonly known as a clear cut, but what's technically known as clear fell coppice, and that's inappropriate in many situations, if not most situations. So being aware of the type of disturbance will often get you the best results. So there's other factors, of course, that go into these formulas, but herbivory is a big one, and I'm going to come back on that. But water availability, for example, upland versus riparian, what other species are present, their flammability, their interactions with each other, sometimes even interactions of wildlife species, either predators or not, and how does that influence herbivory, for example. And then finally, I can't overemphasize enough the idea of resilient systems, and I'm going to come back to this theme near the end. But basically, nothing's a done deal because the climate is warming. We often see climate projections that are sort of one-way or linear patterns, and this is what's going to happen to this or that plant species or animal species. But that's only if we allow them to remain in a very vulnerable state. And so there are things that we can do to make systems more resilient. I believe you're aware of that, but I often see people sort of throwing their hands up in the air when they talk about climate and the future, saying, oh, that's too big or it's out of our hands. Now, there's things at the landscape level that we can do to make systems more resilient to a changing climate, and that's very important in this discussion, and I'm sure many others. Okay, so I like to think of what we know now about climate change interactions with aspen as being of two minds, two opposing minds, really. So this idea of a climate envelope model where there's continued drought and temperatures are basically moving upslope and sometimes north in latitude, there's a general habitat loss. As you know, there's less land base as you go up in elevation, thinking of a basic pyramidal shape mountain or mountain range. So that would be the contraction sort of part of things. And there's been some work by Rayfelt and their colleagues that is leaned on by a lot of aspen people these days, but this is an evolving picture, as you'll see. And what you can see clearly there is based on their work, and we have to keep in mind this is a model. It's a projection of how we think the future will go. It's a cautionary tale, you might say, is basically a dwindling habitat and sort of a linear pattern, going, gone sort of approach. In contrast to that, the second mind, or the schizophrenia of this, you might think of it, is that increased fire will present growth opportunities, and not just growth in terms of regeneration on site, but also expansion. I talked about that case in Alberta, and we should expect to see, given the fact that seeds can fly a long way, they're very light weight, they can fly tens of kilometers, we should expect to see new areas of aspen grow. So how would these things play out against each other? We don't really know, but we don't want to grab onto one theory or another and say this is where we sit and that's that. So let me run through this sort of modeling exercise with some important works that I think that apply here. By the way, this is the Beartooth Range in the background in Montana from just this past summer, and you see sort of a stable aspen community in the foothills, in the middle ground there, and actually an apron around the bottom of this mountain range. Pretty much stable aspen with few conifer invaders. As soon as you go slightly up in elevation, you're into that montane cirral type. And so we should be thinking right away in our minds, okay, probably different management approaches there. Different things going on, perhaps different wildlife migration patterns and use patterns seasonally, and so that really does affect aspen's future. So this will be kind of a recap, but the envelope approach is a good place to start. It basically takes a habitat of any plant or animal and moves it through time over a landscape using the year and temperature change. Adding on to that, we have these different aspen types, and this work by Mittank et al. From 2014 was modeling aspen types and where they would fall at the landscape scale on based on slope and solar radiation. And so that kind of ferreted out a little bit where we would expect to see, and this is in this case the state of Utah wide, stable aspen versus cereal aspen. And then we go to this next step where we added an element of disturbance. In the case of this paper by Yang et al., which was centered in north central Nevada, they looked at the factors above that envelope approach, adding on the different aspen types based on elevation, but also an element of disturbance, in that case some fire ecology. So we get more complex, we have improvement through time, and it's a cautionary tale of sorts that we sort of look out and consider other factors and don't sort of throw in the towel and say this or that landscape is lost. The key factor in my mind that's missing, and I see this at the scientific level, in the modeling level, but I see it most commonly when we look at stories about aspen in the media, is everything's dying and it's a great disaster, the sky is falling, but there's rarely a discussion of what comes next. And in this case, after disturbance, and we've worked that into our model, what is the herbivory situation? In my mind, that's the most important situation for aspen sustainability across the West, and even that varies highly. There are some areas with no issues, there are some areas with very intense herbivory, really kind of blotting out futures for aspen when you combine it with drought and potential disturbance. So we should always be asking, and more so probably with aspen than any other species, it's so dependent on regeneration. I often say aspen is very good at growing fast and dying fast, but it also rebirths itself well if things are in place, if things are intact. But it also can be stymied, and we see that in a lot of locations, and you'll see some examples ahead. Okay, so this whole theme now coming into the practical side of things, I call resilience is adapting. It's the Aldo Leopold idea of saving all the pieces, and sometimes we forget this. So backing up a little bit, aspen has a very broad ecological amplitude, so it makes a lot of sense that it survives, if you will, in many different ways, in many different environments. So it cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution when we run into difficulties along the way. So it's adaptable if we allow it to, and that if we allow it to is really zeroing in on that resilience theme that I touched on earlier. I believe, and I can debate this with folks, and that's fine, our prevailing management paradigm is to emulate process to the degree possible. So in our management actions, if it stands to reason in my mind that if we follow functional ecology or dominant processes, we stand the best chance of having sustainable systems over the long term. Now, put that in the face of climate change, and we need to adapt an adaptive strategy. So, and also it's important to know that there's a strong science management link. Neither one of us can sort of stop holding hands, if you will, or let go of the other. And sometimes we do that. We get lazy, both sides of the factor in our jobs, and we don't check in periodically to see what's changing. So a slide on disturbance. There's many different kinds of disturbance, even though I'm focusing on fire here. Sort of the things that are catastrophic or happen quickly, I've typed them here, and just a few of them as the fast pitch, those overnight kind of occurrences. Different forest treatments, fire, of course, landslides and avalanche. The slide at the right here is a mass movement or landslide at the edge of Jackson Lake in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and then some regrowth of aspen in that mineral soil that was exposed. So wind events, frost develops, you're all familiar with those, but then there's a whole bunch of the slow march kinds of things, grazing, browsing, including climate and drought, but some of these pathogens that will take individual trees out or take out stands maybe over a decade or two or longer. And so we have to think about those things a little bit differently, and how might we emulate those in our management practices if that's appropriate. At least the one work that I'm aware of by Dominic Kulikowski and his colleagues looked at multiple interacting disturbances in north central Colorado and found that overall, when we get disturbance on top of a disturbance, say fire followed by beetle kill, followed by wind disturbance, that actually those shorter disturbance cycles, as you might guess, favor aspen on the landscape. And we might expect to see some of those, maybe a lot of those, as the climate warms. So a few examples. This is from the Book Cliffs region of far eastern Utah and the far western part of Colorado, right along the border. There's a pretty extreme drought there. This is relatively low elevation aspen, even though it's the highest elevation for that particular area. And you see a lot of overstory death, but what you should notice there is that there's a lot of woody material moving in underneath. So that suggests there's been long-term drought or water deficit issues at this place. But I hope you're developing a keen eye and can see that there's almost no regeneration and recruitment. In this very large landscape study that we published in 2014, we looked at recruitment which could replace the overstory. So what we were looking at was recruitment as a percent of the overstory along the x-axis, and this is just a histogram, and then the frequency of those. About 80% of all the locations we went to had zero recruitment. So this is a big landscape system that's literally collapsing. It cannot be supported when you have a disturbance event like this, a slow-moving one, where the older trees are dying and there's no next generations, there's no waiting trees to take over that. And you're probably guessing that the main situation there is herbivory, in this case a combination of cattle and North American elk. This case, even more extreme, in south central Colorado, a very large landscape, a 10,000 acre fire that was, I believe, was from 2002. They put up a small exclosure. But what we have here is a complete type conversion. And what I'm calling this is sort of what to do to facilitate safe reproduction. And I've kind of hopefully made it a little fun here for you so you remember the message. But this is amazing to me and was really devastating. Here, elk predominantly were even eating conifers. There's simply no forest coming back on this very large landscape that had a stand replacing fire due to almost exclusively to herbivory. Let's bear in mind the fire is part of the natural function that extreme herbivory is not. So abstinence is futile. What I'm getting at here is aspen will reproduce and is probably more commonly reproducing sexually than we previously thought, but it's normal for it to reproduce, as we can see within the fence there. We're not trying to alter or stop that. As a matter of fact, we want to encourage that. But as you'll see here, we might have to curb our burning desires at some point. What I'm driving at there is, if it's ecologically appropriate, fire is great. But in many instances, if they're not fire-prone systems, or perhaps if they're systems that have intense herbivory, we might not want to burn before we could get to number 3. Don't do it without protection. So all of this is leaning towards a prescription for safe reproduction in aspen, and that's really the #1 issue with aspen across the West, is a cessation, sometimes for many decades, of reproduction and recruitment. Another cautionary tale from the Fish Lake National Forest. This is an older cutting area where no forest grew back at all due to herbivory, and you can see that. This was a cereal type. They could have burned it. They used a clear-cut approach, and they have no forest now. There's some decent evidence to suggest that aspen facilitates growth of fir by Sam St. Clair and his peers at Brigham Young University. And in this case, this picture seems to uphold that idea that without the aspen growing back, they have no forest at all. And so the overall message here is being in tune with the functional ecology of that place and trying to manage appropriately. So I'm going to divert slightly here to the Pando clone, if you're not familiar with that term. Pando is a giant aspen clone thought to be the largest living thing on Earth, 106 acres or 43 hectares in central Utah. And this also has had a cessation of reproduction for years, probably decades, due to herbivory. And this is a more complex situation. We can't really point a finger directly at cattle or deer or elk, but probably some combination of those three. has sort of thrown things off a cycle, and now we have this world-famous aspen clone, which is made up predominantly of senior citizens with no understory. So what you're looking at here is a photo of an area within the fence, and in 2013 we did some experiments within a fenced area and then measured over time what would happen. So this is pretty simple though, but outside the fence we have virtually no reproduction, and inside the fence we have mounting reproduction. And to put a statistical test on that, the Mann-Whitney U test is a non-parametric test for difference between two groups. We see there's an obvious difference, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. What's maybe a little bit more illustrative is this picture of age classes. If you could just think of the ones on the left, the blue being less than 1/2 meter in height, the red being 1/2 to 1 meter, and the green being 1 to 2 meters. Our goal is to get things above 2 meters in height, out of the browse reach of the predominant herbivores in the area. But we see a really nice progression of taller things, and I've taken some photos and was just there 2 weeks ago, and we have quite a number of trees over 2 meters, but this is just in an experimental area, about 13 acres in size that's fenced off. Within that area, we did some trials. We did some burning, some removal of common juniper, and then some selective cutting of half the mature trees. Again, this is all a single clone, so you might say we've controlled for genotype. All of the trees in theory should react very much similarly. What we see here is that there's definitely a significant improvement through the 3 years. That's really a recasting of the last slide. We have a slight improvement on the right of treatment versus passive, again within the fence. So what I mean by passive treatment is just protecting it alone. We have ample reproduction, but we have slightly better, significantly slightly better if we treated it. And again, those of you who are foresters or forest ecologists are aware that aspen really does well with stimulation usually, but we don't always have to stimulate it. So this idea that apical dominance interruption of that is needed is a bit of a fallacy, because there's always some level of reproduction, even though it's sometimes a smaller level. But what an interesting finding was that we found no significant difference between these different treatment types. A little bit more with burning versus shrub removal versus selective cutting, but not a significant difference. So you can recap that by saying a big go on the passive restoration, or just looking at all the trees inside the fence in the upper panel. In the middle one, a significant, marginally so, improvement with treatment, and then no difference between the treatment types. So I'm going to switch pace here a little bit and talk about the people side of thing, and how do we improve our aspen management. And I don't see any way around this with shrinking budgets and shrinking staffs, but to share resources. I mean, that's the take-home message. So collaborative stewardship, even inside and outside the agencies between widely varying groups, has shown some promise given our current situation for natural resource management. Sharing information in an interdisciplinary way, using webinars such as we are today, and different kinds of information sharing, both technical information and experience on the ground, and making those a two-way loop. We should never have one-way communication where one group appears to have the knowledge and they're handing it to the others. There's a lot of exchange in these kinds of things. And just, I'll get on with it here in a minute, but the idea that research and monitoring go hand in hand. So a process, setting up a process to do this is outlined in detail in the handbook that's due out that the BLM is going to be publishing, but it looks something like this, what I'm calling these aspen resilient steps. So first of all, figuring out and determining what system you're in. Again, not all aspen are alike. Using experts on the ground, experts in the area to determine what type of system do we have and what are the main influences. Perhaps what is the situation, what are the main causes in a subjective way of how we've got there. And then consulting local experts and stakeholders. So in the past we often relied heavily on a government agency or scientists to have the answers, and that model really doesn't hold up very much anymore, because a lot of people have a lot of different information. And so if we strut to the table as the experts or as the professionals on the ground without sharing information, I believe we're at a loss. So next up, we're going to determine what we think are the causes through actual monitoring before anything's done, and also consulting available science. Documenting a plan, writing up a plan, having it reviewed, getting more outside opinion, and then finally you have to take a step and implement it, but then setting up that resilience cycle. Again, this is not a new idea. I'm not delusional enough to think this is brand new, but this is putting a framework around it for ways to step forward. So the idea that you monitor, did we get what we thought we were, and if not, how do we adapt and move on? I've just seen so many instances in my career around the entire West of folks saying, we did the treatment, we walked away, we know it's successful because we drove by it 2 years later. I think we're just going to have to get better than that, not only for our stakeholders, but for the public at large, I believe. Okay, so a couple of scenarios to run through. So if we have a warming climate, temperatures are going up, but perhaps precipitation's decreasing in the cirral montane environment, such as you see here. Again, this is the Peterson Hollow fire. Apache fire in northern Utah that was about 1,000 acres in size total. We have increasing fire we're expecting, so probably increasing aspen, at least in the short term, excuse me. But with increasing elevation, we might see a decrease in distribution, i.e. there being less habitat at the lower elevations for aspen to grow back. So these are open-ended questions here. How would we handle fire suppression in the future? Is this good or bad for aspen? Is it good or bad for aspen moving forward in a warming climate? That's the key question. Similarly, tree harvest. Is clear fell coppice appropriate for all situations in cirral environments? Perhaps not. When we see the patchy nature of these fires, perhaps so in some areas where aspen commonly burns in very hot intermix with conifers. So another situation, a very different situation. This is a little bit fuzzy, the photo, but it was taken from about 2 miles away across a valley. This is what I call an aspen ghost forest. This forest is unlikely to live. This is that Book Cliff situation in which the steeper slopes did not have cattle on them. It was only Rocky Mountain elk. And there's only mature trees and they're dead. There's no regrowth at all. So this is probably a forest that doesn't have a chance of coming back. And then if we add in a drying climate, what do we get there? On the Colorado Plateau, if we increase the temperature, we get more drought. We expect a decrease in aspen, but also an increase in elevation, a decrease in distribution. We add herbivory into this. In my mind, these pure stands at lower elevations, often on south and southwest facing slopes, but sometimes on large Colorado Plateau environments, are the most threatened in the West because they don't have a likely occurrence of fire or large-scale disturbance to sort of bail them out and reinvigorate the system. So in these cases, we would take a different look at browsing and go right to the cause. What are we going to do about domestic and wild herbivores? If we can't keep them moving, how would we reduce the numbers? These are open-ended questions, remind you. And then tree harvesting. What is the appropriate tree harvesting? In this case, certainly not a clear-cut coppice approach because the natural disturbance or functional ecology of this is not geared around that, that complete overstory removal, but especially so in the case where we have such intense herbivory. I would liken this to a case where we stepped up to the blackjack table and we put our entire bet on our first hand. And it could go one way or the other, but it's likely going to go the other way given that the odds are against you at those kinds of places. Okay, so coming into the end here, just some parting words, excuse me. This is from the Wallow fire in Arizona. I believe that's 2011. How do we proceed here? Some sort of general take-home messages. I suggest preserving processes and really focusing on processes as opposed to composition exclusively. Protecting the young is very key in aspen stands. So fires happen, catastrophic disturbance happens, droughts happen. What happens next is really more key in my opinion. Promote species balance. So again, I have to emphasize it's not all and only about aspen, but it's about the multiple species that are dependent on aspen and the interaction of aspen with surrounding environments. We're working on public land and private land, and more commonly now this term borderlands, and I'm doing quite a bit of work on that now, where public land issues or public land wildlife and forest management spill onto private lands, and can actually accelerate declines in aspen communities. So the collaborative participation is very important, and then finally people play an important role here, and that's part of the collaboration, but it's also inviting diverse ideas and opinions to the table to move forward. So with that in mind, I'll just leave these key sources out there that folks can access afterward. And I thank you very much for your time here. You can see that if you have more interest in this, or if you want to join the Western Aspen Alliance, it's a free service. You can do so online. And if what we don't handle in questions today, you can email me directly. That would be fine too. So with that, I'll hand it back.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. So at this point, we're going to open it up to questions from our audience. And as Rick mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, you can use that control panel that you should see as a kind of red arrow on your screen to expand that control panel and type in your questions. And so, Paul, we've got 2 questions that have come in already, and I'll go ahead and read those out and give our audience a moment to continue to add in additional questions. So the first question that came in here, so towards the end of your presentation, you used the term intense herbivory. And could you just give a little more explanation of what exactly that is?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, I can. So basically, I use the metric of enough recruitment. And again, recruitment is specifically defined as taller than 2 meters, but less than the height of the canopy trees. But enough of those younger sapling-sized trees to replace the overstory is my ultimate goal. So intense herbivory would be, some would measure that as greater than 20 or 30% herbivory or browsing on all stems in a given year. So the idea being over time that would be enough herbivory to prevent sustainable reproduction of the stand. And this is, in reality, it's different for different situations. So that's why I like that relative metric of enough saplings or recruitment trees to replace the standing live trees now, because that varies quite a bit from place to place. There are older metrics that would say something like 500 trees per acre. That translates to about 1,200 trees per hectare. Those metrics are out there, standardized metrics, but I prefer one that's more site-specific. So basically, that sustained browsing, I don't mean just 1 year, but I mean sustained browsing, and it's often clear that it's going on for years, if not decades. If that sustained level is going on, then you will not have a stand that's going to replace that over time. Let me just drill down a little bit about with single time measurements, I can detect a trend, and let me unpack that because a lot of you might not like that phraseology. But if I can measure, say, 1,000 regeneration, the shorter reproduction stems in a hectare in 1 year, and I have 23 recruitment, the taller ones, in that same place, I know that this is a system that's been interrupted for many years, likely decades. Often cases, such as in that Book Cliffs example, there were many places where there was 0 recruitment, and clearly that's describing a trend to me, even though I've only measured it 1 time. Ideally, of course, I want more than 1 time measurement, but that's a strong indicator of a long-term trend going certainly years, if not decades.
Great, thank you. We've had a few more questions that have come in here. So this one starts with a bit of a comment, but it is, we're currently starting a project in southwestern Idaho, which will target western juniper removal in and around stands of aspen. Single tree burns will be conducted within the aspen stands 1 to 2 years post-treatment. Any recommendations for monitoring within the stands? Are there consistent monitoring protocols for monitoring recruitment after a treatment?
Yeah, there are some standard protocols. There's a range of them that have developed in different sub-regions of the listening audience today. But I have some monitoring protocols and have a whole chapter on monitoring in that upcoming BLM book. Interestingly, the western juniper is an interesting case. That would that actually dominate the aspen site over time? I would actually have to defer to others on that. That is not my territory that I'm real familiar with, but it's not often known as a dominant tree. But I could be wrong. I shouldn't go too far down that trail. So that but basically you've got to have that regular regeneration and recruitment, and even with a mild disturbance such as your single tree treatments and burning, you should see regeneration there. If it's not there, that doesn't mean the trees are not regenerating. Often they're browsed right down to the ground level, and so that's a fault of some studies where they say that tree systems have died out. Well, sometimes you have to look very close and can't even find the regeneration because they're so hotly demanded by those herbivores.
Great, thank you. We've got quite a few questions that have come in here, so I'll try and get through as many of them as we can. The next one is, are sexually reproduced seedlings camouflaged within a mass of young reed sprouts?
Oh, yeah, they often are in the southwest monsoonal environment, and I believe this would hold for other places, but with so little data, we're not sure. But in that environment, the suckers came in year one of the fire in the same year. So fires burned in that part of the country in the early part of summer. There was ample suckering up to half a meter tall by the end of the year, by August, September, by the end of the growing season. But it was the following year where the seedlings came in intermixed among those suckers right into that dense, a relatively dense regrowth. So that is a possibility, a strong possibility. The key there, I think many people know, but if you don't, is the exposure of mineral soil for the seeds to germinate in, and ample amount of moisture at just the right time. They have about a 14-day window where they can germinate.
Great, thank you. And this is something that you've already touched on, but could you expand a little bit on resilience as a goal? The question here is that they don't know whether it's just a semantics thing, but some folks are growing quite critical of resilience when they translate it as stability. Your focus on process speaks to that, but the composition part of resilience may take much longer successional time frames than process resilience. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess I couldn't agree with that statement more. It is sticky, and I realize there are many critics, and I like the term because I feel like I can measure resilience in terms of the amount of active and ongoing recruitment in an aspen system. Of course, that's dependent on those different types, but that's one key way of measuring resilience for me. Obviously, the overstory mortality and some other factors would come into play there. But is the system regenerating? I'm not bothered at all by the fact that aspen systems are disturbed and even 100% mortality, but that looking next, that next snapshot, that's the resilience part. And resilience to me evokes time and waiting, and I think that the questioner is insinuating that, and I couldn't agree with that individual more.
Great, thank you. So, Paul, what do you think will happen with aspen insects and diseases under climate change? Do you think Cytospora and other cankers could limit regeneration of aspen?
Well, that's a complex question. Let me try to take a dive in. Generally speaking, trees in general, but aspen perhaps even more so, it's so susceptible to a wide range of insects and disease. I often say that it's thin-skinned, so it easily gets everything. So with just the strain of increasing drought, I would expect to see more aspen die-offs. But I don't believe that those pathogens will limit the regeneration. Generally speaking, again, I could be corrected with certain pathogens, but generally speaking, the recruitment, the suckering, regeneration, and recruitment are going to be quite vigorous and somewhat resistant to be an infection early on. So I don't see that affecting things long term. Of course, it's the complex interaction of drought, perhaps amplified insects and disease, and herbivory that really puts us in a fix. And that's, if I haven't gotten that message across today, I hope it's clear now.
Great, thank you. And Paul, at what age are young aspen considered to be resistant and resilient to herbivory or trampling? How long should we attempt to limit herbivores entering freshly disturbed stands?
Oh, another excellent question. Well, on average, when we've clipped stems and counted the rings, on average 5 years. Let's look at both ends here. Aspen can grow a meter in a year, and it's only been 3 years since we fenced off that site at the Pando clone, and we have some that are 3 meters tall, so that's really great. And so in that case, we might say that for those individual stems, well, 3 years, they're probably safe. On the other hand, in very dry sites, it could take 5 to 10 years or more, perhaps, to get to that quote-unquote safe site. Now, let me give you the exception. There are numerous instances that I'm aware of in northern Arizona and northern New Mexico where even tall trees are, and when I say tall, I mean 4 to 5 meters or 20 to 25 feet in height, that are being pushed over by herbivores in need of the high nutrition that aspen brings. So it's somewhat dependent on the carrying capacity. Perhaps that's a little bit of an antiquated term for some, but I don't believe it is. If animals are desperate enough, they're now known to access stems over that height. But in most areas, I feel safe with that approximately 5-year estimate, but monitoring that on a local scale. So if you're putting up some localized fencing, for example, that would be a reasonable term to consider, but of course you're going to get into that adaptive cycle where you're checking as you go to make sure what you thought was right is actually right.
Great, thank you. We've got a few more here. We'll see how many we can get through in the next few minutes. Are you discussing the absence of native predators with any agencies or NGOs as a factor in the herbivory dilemma, and identifying any opportunities to restore this ecological component into systems?
That's a good question, obviously a big and difficult question. I am not personally discussing that, although when I talk about restoring process, I mean all of these ecological processes, including predator-prey interactions, which would be so important to sustainable systems in my mind. However, I'm not naive enough to think that politics and the people part doesn't play a huge role here. When we do workshops, we often, and collaborative workshops, often we say, you know, we can take the ecology so far, and we sometimes feel somewhat confident in perhaps our 40% of knowledge of ecological systems, but we can only take that so far, even in that at that level of confidence, before we run into the people factor. And that's why I ended with people play a part. Is basically, in a perfect world, we would have those intact systems, but the politics of this is way beyond me as a scientist. Nonetheless, how might we emulate those processes? That's what I fall back on, because I'm not going to personally influence the processes other than make recommendations. Sure, that would be great to have predators, but there are a lot of considerations if I made that statement, and those considerations based on people's interests and concerns should be taken into mind. Having said that, of course, there's some examples where predators have been recently restored, and there looks like some very positive signs in terms of sustainable, resilient ecosystems coming out of that. There's a lot of controversy around that as well in the science, and I'm not going to go down that trail right now, but perhaps at another time if folks wanted to.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time here for one more question, and for those of you who haven't had your question yet answered, we will send these to Paul so he can follow up with those of you who still have remaining questions. So here, in an example aspen stand that has a lack of significant disturbance, intense herbivory, and heavy conifer encroachment, what treatment do you think should be prioritized with limited resources?
So let me restate that. I might not have heard it clearly. And you say there's a lack of regeneration and there's intense encroachment by conifers. And what was the last part?
So it was a lack of significant disturbance, okay, intense herbivory, and then heavy conifer encroachment. Yeah, so what we often talk about in workshops is identifying the causal factors here. So what's the problem exactly? I'm not one to say encroachment, and I say that in quotes, that word, encroachment, is always a problem. Our fire cycle's truly out of whack. In some areas they are, in some areas they aren't. It would be site-specific. It's clear that intense herbivory is not a process that's sustainable over time. So that's a root cause.
if we were to do anything, be it mechanical treatment or fire, reintroduction of fire, we wouldn't want to touch either one of those until we address that root cause of the herbivory. Otherwise, like some of my examples, we might turn something that's a forest into a non-forest through our actions. And so it's delicately stepping forward, but identifying all the causes and what's going on here. I have to reiterate that I'm not convinced that that fire cycles are that far out of whack in all locations, but I would have to know the specific instance in which the question arises, and we'd probably want to look at that with a diverse group of disciplinary specialists, both professional and scientific, to address that situation.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. This has been really wonderful. We've come to the end of our time for today's webinar. So like I said, if you have additional questions, Paul's contact information is here on the screen. And thank you to those who attended today's webinar. A recording of the presentation will be available on our website later this week, and we'll also post copies of these slides that Paul presented on, so if you'd like to reference any of those. As I mentioned, if you have any questions about the Great Basin LCC, Rick Carney, the LCC coordinator's contact information is here on the screen, as well as Paul's, so feel free to reach out to either of them. I'd like to invite you all to join us for our next webinar in the Great Basin LCC webinar series, which will be on Friday, November 4th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And this webinar will focus on forecasting changes in sagebrush disturbance and abundance under climate change. And that will be with Peter Adler of the Utah State University. Last but not least, we really want to know what you thought of today's webinar. So please take our short 2-minute survey that will appear on your screen as you log off. Your feedback is really valuable, and it helps us plan and improve our future webinars. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and I hope you have a great day. All right, goodbye.